architectural approach to building the company. We will more thoroughly discuss Welch and GE in Chapter 8. An architectural approach. Clock builders at work. As in the case of Charles Coffin versus George Westinghouse, we did see in our study differences between the two groups of early shapers, but the differences were more subtle than great leader versus not great leader. The key difference, we believe, is one of orientation. The evidence suggests to us that the key people at formative stages of the visionary companies had a stronger organizational orientation than in the comparison companies, regardless of their personal leadership style. As the study progressed, in fact, we became increasingly uncomfortable with the term leader and began to embrace the term architect or clock builder. A second key difference relates to the type of clock they built, the subject of later chapters. The following contrasts further illustrate what we mean by an architectural or clock building approach. Citicorp versus Chase. James Stillman, Citicorp's president from 1891 to 1909 and chairman to 1918, concentrated on organizational development in pursuit of his goal to build a great national bank. He transformed the bank from a narrow parochial firm into a fully modern corporation. He oversaw the bank as it opened new offices, instituted a decentralized, multi-divisional structure, constructed a powerful board of directors composed of leading CEOs, and established management, training, and recruiting programs, instituted 3 decades earlier than at Chase. Citibank 1812-1970 describes how Stillman sought to architect an institution that would thrive far beyond his own lifetime. Stillman intended National City, precursor to Citicorp, to remain its position as the largest and strongest bank in the United States, even after his death. And to ensure this, he filled the new building with people who shared his own vision and entrepreneurial spirit, people who would build an organization. He would step aside himself and let them run the bank. Stillman wrote in a letter to his mother about his decision to step aside to the role of chairman so that the company could more easily grow beyond him. I have been preparing for the past 2 years to assume an advisory position at the bank and to decline re-election as its official head. I know this is wise, and it not only relieves me of the responsibility of details, but gives my associates an opportunity to make names for themselves and lay the foundation for limitless possibilities, greater even for the future than what has been accomplished in the past. Albert Wiggin, Stillman's counterpart at Chase, president from 1911 to 1921, did not delegate at all. Decisive, humorless, and ambitious, Wiggins' primary concern appeared to be with his own aggrandizement. He sat on the boards of 50 other companies and ran Chase with such a strong centralized controlling hand that Business Week wrote, "The Chase Bank is Wiggin and Wiggin is the Chase Bank." Walmart versus Amos. No doubt, Sam Walton had the personality characteristics of a flamboyant, charismatic leader. We cannot help but think of his shimmy shaking down Wall Street in a grass skirt and flowerless backed by a band of hula dancers to fulfill a promise to employees for breaking 8% profit, or his leaping up on store counters and leading hundreds of screaming employees through a rousing rendition of the Walmart cheer. Yes, Walton had a unique and powerful personality, but so did thousands of other people who didn't build a Walmart. Indeed, the key difference between Sam Walton and the leaders at Amos is not that he was a more charismatic leader, but that he was much more of a clock builder, an architect. By his early 20s, Walton had pretty much settled upon his personality style. He spent the bulk of his life in a never-ending quest to build and develop the capabilities of the Walmart organization. So, in a quest to develop his leadership personality, this was true even in Walton's own eyes, as he wrote in Made in America. What nobody realized, including a few of my own managers at the time, was that we were really trying from the beginning to become the very best operators, the most professional managers that we could. There's no question that I have the personality of a promoter, but underneath that personality, I have always had the soul of an operator, somebody who wants to make things work well, then better, then the best they possibly can. I was never in anything for the short haul. I always wanted to build as fine a retailing organization as I could. For example, Walton valued change, experimentation, and constant improvement. But he didn't just preach these values. He instituted concrete organizational mechanisms to stimulate change and empowerment, using a concept called a store within a store. Walton gave department managers the authority and freedom to run each department as if it were their own business. He created cash awards and public recognition for associates who contribute cost-saving and or service enhancements ideas that could be reproduced at other stores. He created VPI, Volume Producing Item, contests to encourage associates to attempt creative experiments. He instituted merchandise meetings to discuss experiments that should be selected for use throughout the entire chain, and Saturday morning meetings, which often featured an individual employee who tried something novel that worked really well. Profit sharing and employee stock ownership produced a direct incentive for employees to come up with new ideas so that the whole company might benefit. Tips and ideas generated by associates got published in the Walmart Internal magazine. Walmart even invested in a satellite communication system to spread all the little details around the company as soon as possible. In 1985, stock analyst A.G. Edwards described the ticking Walmart clock. Personal operate in an environment where change is encouraged. For example, if a store associate makes suggestions regarding merchandising or cost saving ideas, these ideas are quickly disseminated. Multiply each suggestion by over 750 stores and by over 80,000 employees who can potentially make suggestions, and this leads to substantial sales gains, cost reductions, and improved productivity. Whereas Walton concentrated on creating an organization that would evolve and change on its own. Amos leaders dictated all changes from above and detailed in a book the precise steps a store manager should take, leaving no room for initiative, whereas Walton groomed a capable successor to take over the company after his death, David Glass. The Gilmans had no such person in place, thus leaving the company to outsiders who did not share their philosophy. Whereas Walton passed along his clock building orientation to his successor, post founder CEOs at Amos recklessly pursued disastrous acquisitions in an blind, obsessive pursuit of raw growth for growth's sake, gulping down 388 Zay's stores in one bite. In describing Walmart's key ingredient for future success, David Glass said Walmart associates will find a way, and or people are relentless. Amos, CEO of the same era, said the real answer and the only issue is market share. In a sad note, a 1990 Forbes article on Amos noted, co-founder Herbert Gilman has seen his creation destroyed. On a happier note, Sam Walton died with his creation intact and the belief that it could prosper long beyond him, stronger than ever. He knew that he would probably not live to the year 2000, yet shortly before he died in 1992, he set audacious goals for the company out to the year 2000, displaying a deep confidence in what the company could achieve independent of his presence. Motorola versus Zenith. Motorola's founder, Paul Galvin, dreamed first and foremost about building a great and lasting company. Galvin, architect of one of the most successful technology companies in history, did not have an engineering background, but he hired excellent engineers. He encouraged decent discussion and disagreement and gave individuals the latitude to show what they could do largely on their own. He set challenges and gave people immense responsibilities so as to stimulate the organization and its people to grow and learn. Often by failures and mistakes, Galvin's biographer summarized, he was not an inventor, but a builder whose blueprints were built. Whose blueprints were people. According to his son, Robert W. Galvin, my father urged us to reach out to people, to all the people, for their leadership contribution. Yes, their creative leadership contribution. Early on, he was obsessed with management succession. Ironically, he did not fear his own demise. His concern was for the company, emphasis ours. In contrast, Zenith's founder, Commander Eugene F. McDonald Jr., had no succession plan, thus leaving a void of talent at the top after his unexpected death in 1958. McDonald was a tremendously charismatic leader who moved the company forward primarily through the sheer force of his gigantic personality. Described as the volatile, opinionated mastermind of Zenith, McDonald had colossal self-assurance based on a very high opinion of his own judgment. He expected all except his closest friends to address him as commander. A brilliant tinkerer and experimenter who pushed many of his own inventors and ideas. He had a rigid attitude that almost caused Zenith to miss out on television. A history of Zenith states. McDonald's flamboyant style was echoed in the company's dramatic advertising methods, and this style, coupled with innovative genius and an ability to sense changes in public taste, meant that for more than 3 decades in the public perception, McDonald was Zenith. 2.5 years after McDonald's death, Fortune magazine commented, Zenith is still growing and reaping profits from the drive and imagination of its late founder. McDonald's powerful personality remains a palpable influence in the company. But Zenith's future now depends on its ability and new drive to meet conditions McDonald never anticipated. A competitor commented, as time goes on, Zenith will miss McDonald more and more. Galvin and McDonald died within 18 months of each other. Motorola sailed successfully into new arenas never dreamed of by Galvin. Zenith languished, and as of 1993, it never regained the energy and innovative spark that it had during McDonald's lifetime. Walt Disney versus Columbia Pictures. Quick, stop and think. Disney, what comes to mind? Can you create a clear image or set of images that you associate with Disney? Now do the same thing for Columbia Pictures. What comes to mind? Can you put your finger on distinct and clear images? If you're like most people, you can conjure up images of what Disney means, but you probably had trouble with Columbia Pictures. In the case of Walt Disney, it is clear that Walt brought immense personal imagination and talent to building Disney. He personally originated many of Disney's best creations, including Snow White, the world's first ever full-length animated film, the character of Mickey Mouse, the Mickey Mouse Club, Disneyland, and Epcot Center. By any measure, he was a superb time teller. But even so, in comparison to Harry Kahn, Disney's counterpart at Columbia Pictures, Walt was much more of a clock builder. Kahn cultivated his image as a tyrant, keeping a riding whip near his desk and occasionally cracking it for emphasis. And Columbia had the greatest creative turnover of any major studio, due largely to Kahn's methods. An observer of his funeral in 1958 commented that the 1,300 attendees had not come to bid farewell, but to make sure he was actually dead. We could find no evidence of any concern for employees by Kahn, nor could we find any evidence that he took steps to develop the long-term capabilities or distinct self-identity of Columbia Pictures as an institution. The evidence suggests that Kahn cared first and foremost about becoming a movie mogul and wielding immense personal power in Hollywood. He became the first person in Hollywood to assume the titles of president and producer, and cared little or not at all about the quantities and identity of the Columbia Picture Company that might endure beyond his lifetime. Kahn's personal purpose propelled Columbia Pictures forward for years, but such personal and egocentric ideology could not possibly guide and inspire a company after the founder's death. Upon Kahn's death, the company fell into listless disarray, had to be rescued in 1973, and was eventually sold to Coca-Cola. Walt allies Disney, on the other hand, spent the day before he died in a hospital bed thinking out loud about how to best develop Disney World in Florida. Walt would die, But Disney's ability to make people happy, to bring joy to children, to create laughter and tears would not die. Throughout his life, Walt Disney paid greater attention to developing his company and its capabilities than did Kahn at Columbia. In the late 1920s, he paid his creative staff more than he paid himself. In the early 1930s, he established art classes for all animators, installed a small zoo on location to provide live creatures to help improve their ability to draw animals, invented new animation team processes such as storyboards, and continually invested in the most advanced animation technologies. In the late 1930s, he instilled the first generation bonus system in the cartoon industry to attract and reward good talent. In the 1950s, He instituted employee, you create happiness training programs, and in the 1960s, he established Disney University to orient, to train, and indoctrinate Disney employees. Harry Kahn took none of these steps. Granted, Walt did not clock build as well as some of the other architects in our study, and the Disney Film Studio languished for nearly 15 years after his death as Disney's ran around asking themselves, what would Walt do? But the fact remains that Walt, unlike Kahn, created an institution much bigger than himself, an institution that could still deliver the Disney magic to kids at Disneyland decades after his death. During the same time period that Columbia ceased to exist as an independent entity, the Walt Disney Company mounted an epic and ultimately successful fight to prevent a hostile takeover. To the Disney executives and family who could have made a tidy multi-million dollar profit on their stock had the Raiders been successful, Disney had to be preserved as an independent entity because it was Disney. In the preface to his book, Storming the Magic Kingdom, a superb account of the Disney takeover attempt, John Taylor wrote, "To accept the takeover offer was unthinkable. Walt Disney Productions was not just another corporate entity that needed to be rationalized by liquidation and its assets to achieve maximum value for its shareholders. Nor was Disney just another brand name. The company's executives saw Disney as a force shaping the imaginative life of children around the world. It was woven into the very fabric of American culture. Indeed, its mission, and it did, they believed, have a mission as important as making money for its stockholders, was to celebrate American values." Disney went on in the 1980s and 1990s to rekindle the heritage installed by Walt decades earlier. In contrast, Kahn's company had little to save or rekindle. No one felt Columbia had to be preserved as an independent entity. If the shareholders could get more money by selling out, then so be it. The message for CEOs, managers, and entrepreneurs. One of the most important steps you can take in building a visionary company is not an action, but a shift in perspective. There will be plenty of action-oriented findings in the chapters that follow, but to make good use of them requires first and foremost acquiring the right frame of mind. And that's the point of this chapter. We're doing nothing less than asking you to make a shift in thinking as fundamental as those that preceded the Newtonian Revolution, the Darwinian Revolution, and the founding of the United States. Prior to the Newtonian Revolution, people explained the world around them primarily in terms of a God that made specific decisions. A child would fall and break his arm, and it was an act of God. Crops failed, and it was an act of God. People thought of an omnipotent God who made each and every specific event happen. Then in the 1600s, people said, no, that's not it. What God did was to put in place a universe with certain principles. And what we need to do is figure out how those principles work. God doesn't make all the decisions. He set in place processes and principles that would carry on. From the point on, from that point on, people began to look for basic underlying dynamics and principles of the entire system. That's what the Newtonian Revolution was all about. Similarly, the Darwinian Revolution gave us a dramatic shift in thinking about biological species and natural history, a shift in thinking that provides fruitful analogies to what we've seen in the visionary companies. Prior to the Darwinian Revolution, people primarily presumed that God created each and every species intact and for a specific role in the natural world. Polar bears are white because God created them that way. Cats purr because God created them that way. Robins have red breasts because God created them that way. We humans have a great need to explain the world around us by presuming that someone or something must have had it all figured out. Something must have said, we need robins with red breasts to fit here in the ecosystem. But if the biologists are right, it doesn't work that way. Instead of jumping directly to robins with red breasts time telling, we have instead an underlying process of evolution, the genetic code, DNA, genetics, variation, and mutation, natural selections, which eventually produces robins with red breasts that appear to fit perfectly in the ecosystem. The beauty and functionality of the natural world springs from the success of its underlying processes and intricate mechanisms in a marvelous ticking clock. Likewise, we're asking you to see the success of visionary companies, at least in part, as coming from underlying processes and fundamental dynamics embedded in the organization and not primarily the result of a single great idea of some great, all knowing, godlike visionary who made great decisions, had great charisma, and led with great authority. If you're involved in building and managing a company, we're asking you to think less in terms of being a brilliant product visionary or seeking the personality charismatics of charismatic leadership, and to think more in terms of being an organizational visionary and building charismatics of a visionary company. Indeed, we're asking you to consider a shift in thinking analogous to the shift required to found the United States in the 1700s. Prior to the dramatic revolutions in political thought of the 17th and 18th countries, the prosperity of a European kingdom or country depended in large part on the quality of the king, or in the case of England, perhaps the queen. If you had a good king, then you had a good kingdom. If the king was a great and wise leader, then the kingdom might prosper as a result. Now compare the good king frame of reference with the approach taken at the founding of the United States. The critical question at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 was not who should be president, who should lead us, who is the wisest among us, who would be the best king. No, the founders of the country concentrated on such questions as what processes can we create that will give us good presidents long after we're dead and gone? What type of enduring country do we want to build? On what principles? How should it operate? What guidelines and mechanisms should we construct that will give us the kind of country we envision? Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and John Adams were not charismatic visionary leaders in the it all depends on me mode. No, they were organizational visionaries. They created a constitution to which they and all future leaders would be subservient. They focused on building a country. They rejected the good king model. They took an architectural approach. They were clock builders. But notice, in the case of the United States, it's not a cold, mechanistic, Newtonian, or Darwinian clock. It's a clock based on human ideals and values. It's a clock built on human needs and aspirations. It's a clock with a spirit. And that brings us to the second pillar of our findings. It's not just building any random clock. It's building a particular type of clock. Although the shapes, sizes, mechanisms, styles, ages, and other attributes of the ticking clocks vary across visionary companies, we found that they share an underlying set of fundamental characteristics. In the chapters that follow, we describe these characteristics. For now, the important thing to keep in mind is that once you make the shift from time telling to clock building, most of what's required to build a visionary company can be learned. You don't have to sit around waiting until you're lucky enough to have a great idea. You don't have to accept the false view that until your company has a charismatic visionary leader, it cannot become a visionary company. There is no mysterious quality or illusion magic, elusive magic. Indeed, once you learn the essentials, you and all those around you can just get down to the hard work of making your company a visionary company. Built to Last: Successful Habits of Visionary Companies by Jim Collins, best-selling author of Good to Great. Jerry I. Perez. More than 1 million copies sold. Turnpike Plaza, 365, Rec Squad.